My name is Lindsey Miller, and I'm from Scotland originally, from Glasgow. And I'm a musician and composer, and also a writer and photographer. And I ended up in North Korea in 2017 until 2019 because my husband worked for the British Embassy as a diplomat. And so I accompanied him on a diplomatic posting. And we lived in Pyongyang for 2 years. And I think one of the biggest things I've taken away from that experience and what led me to write the book was over the course of those 2 years, I was able to experience the country in a way not many foreigners get to. When most foreigners visit North Korea, it's usually as a tourist, and you have to be there with minders and guides all the time. And you have a very specific, controlled experience of the country. Living there as a diplomatic spouse was a very different experience in that we didn't have that. That's not to say there wasn't some element of control in our lives, but it allowed me to connect or try to connect with the human level of the country. And the North Korean people I found to be so interesting and creative and generous and kind. And this was so different to what I'd experienced learning through the media, where I thought they were very robotic and solely representative of the state. And in fact, they're just people. And that's a really simple but really important message. And so that's why I wanted to write this book, was to convey the humanity of the country and hopefully in a very small way open a window for outsiders to connect on a deeper level. So food is a really important part of life anywhere, and it's exactly the same in North Korea. In Pyongyang particularly, there are lots of different places you can go to eat that serve food from other countries. And I was quite surprised to see that because when we think of North Korea, we think of it being very closed, very secretive. And for there to be influences through food was something I didn't expect. There are pizza restaurants in Pyongyang that serve Italian food and they have Italian wine. And they're busy. There are North Koreans eating there. That's again not to say that everyone can afford to eat there, but they do exist. Similarly, there are places which sell items and produce from other countries, such as soaps from Japan, makeup from China, butter from Ukraine. There are products from all over the world that are available in shops and in the market. And again, people are buying them. And one of my North Korean friends told me that she really preferred Japanese products to Chinese products because they were better quality, and she knew they were more expensive, but they were more desirable. So this influence of the outside world is present. There's also a coffee shop in Pyongyang which sells Starbucks coffee. It's not a Starbucks official chain, but they have Starbucks coffee beans, which again is interesting because it obviously means that someone has left the country, learned that Starbucks is something that people drink and people like, and that's something that's been brought back and put into the city. So there are these little elements that you see around you there that represent the outside world and that North Koreans also participate in. In terms of other big chains, two things were really interesting to me. One was a diner that was in Pyongyang that is designed to look like a McDonald's. It's not a McDonald's, but it sells burgers wrapped in the paper. It sells fries in the little red cardboard box, and shakes, milkshakes and things. So again, someone has also learned what McDonald's is, that people like it, and people go there to eat and enjoy it. There was also one shop in Pyongyang called Miniso. I don't know if you know of Miniso, but it's a popular shop, sells lots of really cute products, and there is a Miniso shop, or at least a shop selling just Miniso products in Pyongyang. And this was a very expensive shop. You had to spend US dollars to shop there, but it was full of people, and especially young women looking at the makeup. And it had electronic devices and all kinds of things. So yeah, so there is there is definitely a presence of outside information, outside culture that's been brought back. If even it's on a very subtle level, it is present, it is there. As for the countryside and more rural towns within shops there are usually items that would come from China. So, for example, in Wonsan, I went to a shop there and they had some vegetables and some fruit that had been brought across the border. So, even if it's not sort of more luxurious items, it's more foodstuffs, that is also still present as well. So I absolutely love North Korean food. It's so spicy and flavorful, and as well in the same anywhere in the world, each family will have its own way or its own recipes, own way of making things. So whenever I had something in a restaurant or a friend had made, and I would ask them, "How did you make that?" They would always like, it's a family secret. We can't tell you. Everyone's got their own way of doing things. Um, of course, kimchi I really like. The reason I like North Korean kimchi is so much more spicy than other kimchi I've had since. And they add chestnuts sometimes to it, and anchovies, and sometimes other meats, and it's really, really nice. Um, but something that I really enjoyed was just a really simple dish of tofu with gochujang, where the tofu is deep fried and is really crispy. And they would make gochujang with spring onions, scallions as well through it, and put it on the top. And it's just a really simple, really flavorful dish.
Mm.
Um, North Korean seafood was also very, very good. When you go to the coastal towns like Nampo or Wonsan, there's very good fish. Um, but something I didn't try that I did see local people eating was on one trip to Nampo, the coastal city. People on the beach had these big sacks of clams,
Mm-hmm.
and they would pour lighter fluid on top of the clams, and it would be on fire, like smoking and barbecuing the clams. So I never tried it, but it was also really popular among local people. So in terms of products in Pyongyang, you could buy at that time at the market, for example. So I used to shop at Tongil Market, which is a large indoor market, the biggest in the city. And there would be a selection of meats and vegetables, seafood, materials, um, anything you can think of, you would probably be able to get at that market.
Yes.
Um, and they would have lots of imported products there. A lot of the stalls where the women who were selling the products stood, they would be very proud if they had apples, for example, and they were from North
Mhm.
Korea. They would hold them up to you and tell you, they're North Korean. These are North Korean apples, are very, very good. And then they would also have things that weren't grown in North Korea, like pineapples. They would have mangoes or strawberries, things that wouldn't necessarily be eaten that I guess very popularly among North Korean people. Um, so yeah, so they you're able to get it at the market. In terms of shops, a lot of the shops in Pyongyang are also stocked with various foreign products. So as I mentioned earlier, there's butter from Ukraine you can buy lots of Russian products as well, like meats, for example. And you can also buy toiletries, makeup. Um, so there's quite a large variety. The other things I was surprised to see were things like wine from Bulgaria, um,
Mhm.
wine from France, lots of German products as well. And a lot of foreigners would shop at these places, but there were also North Koreans who would shop there as well. Um, and again, before I went there, I always assumed that if I saw that on TV and I saw a North Korean person buying a foreign product, that would be staged for the camera to make us think that all North Korean people buy these foreign products. Obviously, not all North Korean people are going to be able to buy those products, but it doesn't mean there aren't some who do and who can and who like to buy them. So I think there's such a breadth of experience of North Korean people, so it's important to look at as much of it as possible, and that's what I'm trying to do in this book. So I think for me, in my experience, when I met someone who had experience of the outside world, in that they either spoke a foreign language, they had experience around foreigners in North Korea, or they had traveled abroad, there was always a very different energy about that person, um, a more willingness to communicate.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, and I talk about this in the book, as a foreigner, you're very aware that your presence can put people at risk in North Korea. So you can make people feel uncomfortable just by being there. And so you have to be very sensitive to that, to not make anyone feel like they're in a compromising situation with you. Um, but in terms of conversation, it was always obvious when I started speaking to someone who had that experience of the outside world that they were different. Um, I remember, and I've written about this in the book, one girl who I met in a shop, and it was just a very kind of normal, unexciting shop. And I'd walked in there just to see what they had, and she spoke fluent English and she spoke Spanish, and she came up to me and spoke this perfect English with a British accent, and I was like, "What? How do you?" She's working in this shop that's tucked away that you just wouldn't think to go in. Um, and she was amazing, and we got talking, and I speak Spanish as well, so we started speaking in Spanish. Um, and she was asking me all kinds of questions and telling me about her foreign friends she'd had when she lived abroad. And again, these are things we don't think of when we think of North Korean
Yeah.
people, but there are people with those experiences, and it's important to acknowledge them. So there was always a difference, but it didn't mean that you could just talk about anything you wanted to with those people either. There was always a curiosity, and even among people who didn't have that much experience, to ask you questions. I would be asked about my family a lot. I would share
Mhm.
photographs on my phone of places I traveled to. You know, um, People would ask me about Scottish politics and Harry Potter, and who my favourite wife of Henry VIII was. And sometimes people would just ask, like, be curious about what I'm wearing, because I wear very different clothes to North Korean women. So it was people were always very curious and very friendly. I never encountered anyone being unfriendly towards me, but there was always a curiosity there. So I did see a lot of behavior that was geared towards the Kim regime. It's something which all North Korean people have to adhere to. There's some photographs of this in the book, and there's stories as well. One moment in particular was a young boy who was playing football, and he was just going down the street kicking a ball. He must have been, I don't know, maybe 6 years old, 7 years old, very young. And he picked up his football and walked up the steps towards one of the big murals of Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il. And he bowed to the mural, and then he stood back, and then he walked back down the steps and started kicking his ball and went off. But this is a daily part of daily life for every North Korean. They have no choice in whether they do these things or not. It's expected of them, demanded of them, and if they don't adhere to those rules, then they could face, a life or death situation. So I also experienced some of the military parades, and that was interesting. And there's some photos from the book again that talk about what that felt like to be among that, because again, I think it's very easy as outsiders to be very black and white when we look at anything, to help us understand it in a more simple way. And by saying, well, all these people around me, they can't possibly believe in this. They can't possibly be having a good time. They can't possibly buy into the regime. But human beings don't work like that. In the same way that you can't say every single person is totally believes in everything and agrees with everything, because they won't. We're human beings. And those who have experienced the outside world, that curiosity to know what other things are out there is obviously going to feed into their views. But there will be people who do really value, especially Kim Il-sung, as a highly regarded leader of the country. And then there will also be people who don't, and then there'll be people in between. In terms of any kind of conversation I had with people, it was always impossible to know truly what a North Korean person thought about those things, because you rarely tell those opinions to their own family and their own friends, so they're not going to tell me. And I would never want to make them feel under pressure to tell me things that would get them into trouble. But the things I spoke to them about that were interesting and I saw was on different ends of the scale, was I watched on TV with some North Korean friends. Kim Jong-un had just made a trip to China for the very first time, and he'd taken a train to meet Xi Jinping. And when he got off the train, on the TV, there was a camera shot of him getting off the train, lots of reporters, flashing cameras. And this was a couple of days after it had happened that it aired on state TV. But I was watching this with some North Korean friends, and they were so excited because they'd never seen anything like that before. They'd never seen the leader at that time go to China, have all these reporters and this attention. It was a totally new thing, and they were texting their friends and their family going, oh, have you seen this? Have you turn on the news? So they were genuinely excited, and you would be if that was something new. But then at the other end of the scale, that same friend, I walked past them one day, and it was outside their work where I used to go talk to them. And I said hello in the street, waved across the road, and they just kept their head down, and they just kind of went like this and kept their head down, because there was a soldier on the street, and there's too much security around for them to be so open to go, oh, hi, so it's impossible to know what goes on inside people's minds without them speaking for themselves. But I think as outsiders, and something I wanted to write about, was it's important that us as outsiders are willing to listen and be open to all different views, so that we are accepting of them and the range of human experiences that North Koreans have. So Pyongyang, to me, my first impressions of it was that it doesn't look like any other city I've ever seen, because it's so colorful, and the buildings are painted bright green, orange, blue, pink. It's a very interesting palette of colors, and the designs of some of the buildings in Pyongyang, particularly in the more modern areas of the city, look very interesting. In Miri Street, where it's the science street, there's a building that's designed to look like a molecule, and it's a big high-rise building. So it's unique. I've never seen anything else like it. And then of course we know that the Ryugyong Hotel, the big
Mm.
triangular hotel that's very famous. So it's very different to anywhere else I've ever been. But also there are parts of the city that are have still have the traditional houses, bungalow style, or so-called harmonica houses, which the government's trying to get rid of and replace with these high-rise buildings. Um, so it is very different in terms of soldiers and military presence. It's important to remember that North Korea has a pretty big armed forces for the size of the country, and people join the military for all kinds of reasons. One can be to increase your level of social status, um, for reputation. It can be for a variety of reasons. So there are lots of armed forces around. Um, I think for me, what was unsettling was that when I first arrived, I really noticed it, was that in the UK, for example, the only time you would see people in uniform around the streets every day would be if there was a threat of some kind. You know, if there'd been, you know, a terrorist attack, or, you know, if there had been something that required public protection and the government called on the military, then you would see soldiers around. But in North Korea, you see them everywhere because there's so many, and they wear their uniform all the time. And what's interesting, and I found this with a lot of things, including the propaganda, was that at first I really noticed it, and after a while, I didn't notice anymore.
Mm.
It just became part of the place. And again, with the book, it I've tried to convey, you know, those things that when you first arrive, you go, oh my goodness, look at the way Pyongyang looks. I've never seen this before. And then actually, after a few months, you go, I'm more interested in that conversation that that lady's having, oh, hanging out her washing, you know, and her children are running around. Like, who is she? What, you know, once you get past that view of what we have as outsiders of North Korea, you start to think about it differently.
Mm.
And I think that's really interesting. So I had the opportunity to travel a bit while I was there. Um, so we didn't live with minders or guides, and there were places we could go on our own. So obviously we could go around Pyongyang. We visited Wonsan, so that's on the coast, and also Nampo, which is also on the coast, several times. Um, we also traveled to Mount Myohyang-san, which is a mountain region, and it's very, very beautiful. And I absolutely love hiking. I grew up in Scotland, walking up mountains, so and also in Taipei as well. I loved walking up hiking there. So it was something that I enjoyed doing while I was in North Korea as well. So Myohyang area was very beautiful, and we also got to travel up to China actually. We drove from Pyongyang up to Sinuiju, which is on the border with Dandong, and that takes about 7 hours or more. And that's a very interesting route because it takes you through rural North Korea countryside, through villages. You don't go through really major cities, to be honest. There are a couple of points, but it's very rural. So that was really interesting. And there, again, there's some stories and photos in the book about that. Um, and then also the DMZ as well. We visited the border from the North Korean side, and I've been there, I think I've been there 3 times. And each time I went there was a completely different experience from the last, because of myself. And again, how over time my perception had changed and my attempts to connect with the place had changed. So I think the thing that really struck me about it was how close or Pyongyang, when you stand on the DMZ, Seoul is not far away at all, and you're very aware of how close you are and how life just could not be more different. It's really quite striking. And the first time I went there, I felt very on edge, very tense. I think it is true that places have an atmosphere. There is an energy around places, and it definitely felt like that there. But as you say, I think also some of that came from me, and how I perceived that place to be even before I'd experienced it for myself. But something, again, it's North Korea for me was a lot of juxtapositions between what I perceived it to be and what it was. And then I would obviously question what it was. And this book is trying to answer those questions. But for the DMZ, for example, I remember being there and feeling really on edge. And that feeling was disrupted by a soldier coming onto the bus where I was sitting. And it was just me and a friend who were on this trip. And he sat next to me and we were talking, and he was the soldier that does the tours for all the various groups. And he just, because you have to take a vehicle to each interesting point for the tour. And so he sat next to me on the bus and we were just chatting, and he was asking me about my life and I asked him about his. And I had a bag of snacks, of biscuits. And so I gave him some biscuits and we sat, the two of us like school children in the back of a bus, eating biscuits and laughing together and talking. And again, even though he's wearing this uniform and he's representative of the state, probably among the most trusted to be around foreigners and convey the message of the regime to foreigners, he was still very friendly and charismatic and talkative. So again, it's just these juxtapositions. I remember visiting Kumgang-san, the mountain area on the border, and we drove past the hotel where North Korean and South Korean families have come together to meet. And there was, you could feel, you could just feel there was an energy left from that building. And I remember just looking at it, thinking of just the amount of human experience that is in that building, of families who are separated by this border, that haven't seen each other in decades, who might not see each other again for decades. Yeah, it was really quite moving. What was interesting for me was I only visited South Korea after having lived in North Korea for about a year. So obviously for a lot of people, it's usually the other way around. But for me, my experience of South Korea was having had this experience of people and a language and the melody of that language and associating it with a very particular place. But something that really struck me was how overwhelmed I felt when I went to South Korea of the busyness of Seoul and how modern it is. There's so many lights, and again, the language itself I'd associated with a really specific experience, but I could see it everywhere. If I saw any posters in Pyongyang, they were for the mass games or they were for propaganda or something. It was always related to the state. Whereas in Seoul, it was advertising for food and cafes and shops and, trying to get you to buy things. And it felt so overwhelming. But I remember sitting in a restaurant in Seoul, and it was raining outside, and I was sitting at the window and I was just looking across the street at these two older South Korean men, and they were talking to each other in the street with their umbrellas, and I was just looking at the way they were dressed and looking at their faces. And I was just thinking the same things I thought when I was in North Korea, which was, what's your story? Who are you? You know, what are these? What are their names? What are their experiences? Do they have family in the north? Because even looking at them, if you change their clothes, you could be watching two people speaking to each other in a rainy street in Pyongyang. You know, it was a really profound moment for me. And but something very similar I found between the two places is just how friendly, funny Korean people are. They are so charismatic and funny and kind and generous. And that was a common thing between both sides of the border. And I have a real great love for the Korean people. So I think in terms of jobs, what you're able to achieve as anyone in North Korea is determined by your social status. So if you are of a low songbun, as it's called, if you're of a low social class, then you're only going to be able to do certain jobs, unless you improve your social status. Likewise, if you are among the most elite, privileged class, upper class, you will get to do kinds of jobs that those who are in the lower classes will never get to do. And that will involve likely being around foreigners, you know, going to university, having these kinds of opportunities. So in terms of the ranges of jobs, you know, you have farmers and people who work in agriculture in the countryside, and you also have people who work through more professional jobs. I mean, in Pyongyang, there are lots of people who work in shops and service industry, but there are lots of people who work in offices. Um, but what's interesting is that in terms of the party, in party offices, it's usually men who work in those jobs. And some women I spoke to of my age in Pyongyang told me about how they really valued their careers, and that was something I, you know, more than children. We were talking about being of the years where your family ask you, you know, when are you going to have children? And they said they wanted to work. They valued that more. And again, that's not to say that every woman is going to have the opportunity to feel that way, you know. But it was interesting that there were those who did. Um, so there's a variety of routes for you, depending, as I say, on what social status you're in. I think it's very easy to think that North Korea doesn't change, and that it's been the same way for a long time. But it does change. It is changing in very small ways, and that is down to the North Korean people. And some ways in which it has changed has been through the roles of men and women within work, for example. So, as I mentioned, that you know, to know someone in Pyongyang, a young woman who values her career more than having a family is really interesting, because that's something that might not have been a view openly held by someone. You know, the fact she also shared that was really interesting. It wasn't something she just kept private. Um, in terms of men's jobs, for me and my experience, men were mostly the ones as I say, going to the offices, working in party offices, um, and members of the Workers' Party. Um, Women, more interestingly, have taken on more of a role within the private trade in North Korea. When you go to the market, for example, in Tongyo Market, or even on the street, when you see people selling fruit or vegetables or products, they're women who will be selling them. And a lot of women are involved in private trade, which is really interesting because that really wasn't a part of North Korean society up until the 90s, you know, when the famine and the difficulties people encountered in being able to obtain food demanded a change in the way that society worked so people could survive. Um, so professionally, that's really interesting. In terms of the family, again, I know another North Korean woman who told me that She had 2 children, and she really missed having free time to go running. She was quite athletic when she was younger and enjoyed exercising. And she said, I just don't have time between work. They have to work every day. And she said, I just don't have time. So I really miss my life before I had a family. And again, I think that's something common with, I think, a lot of women experience. But we wouldn't necessarily think that when we think of North Korea. It has changed, and it will continue to change in very small ways. So we don't always notice it, but it is happening. So in terms of the way people dress, and certainly in Pyongyang, it's very, very strictly controlled in that you are not free to just wear whatever you like. For example, jeans are banned in North Korea, and I wear jeans every day. So it's interesting because even just walking down the street, that act of me wearing denim is an act of freedom, against what North Korean people can do. So it's a really powerful, just you being there is a really, and the way you dress is a really powerful statement. And again, as you say, like I wear sneakers all the time. My North Korean female friends hated them. They thought they were really ugly, and they would say to me like, "Why are you wearing such ugly shoes?" Because they would wear heels, and the heels would be very decorative. Sometimes they would have little stones on them. The type of shoes that I would wear if I was going out, for an event or something. But they would wear them every day. They would hike mountains. I've seen women hiking mountains in heels. Because it's one part, it's within the rules of the system how much people can express themselves. And I think that's what's really fascinating. Like, as I say, with shoes, you have to wear these heeled shoes and look a certain way, but you have ways of customizing them to suit your personality. Very recently, North Korean women have been allowed to wear jewelry, more decorative jewelry. And that was something that I really noticed. And hair pieces, a lot of women would wear these glitter sequin sort of hair slides. And that's another way for them to express themselves. And a lot of women in Pyongyang were also wearing a bit of makeup, But something else that I thought was interesting was the hair. You're not able to express yourself through choosing any haircut, but there are ones which were very popular, which looked more modern to me, which is a very kind of shorter bob. And we know from North Korean defectors speaking that certainly the influence of foreign media, movies like South Korean dramas and things, those will affect how people want to dress and how they want their hair and how they want to look. So seeing these short bobbed haircuts, which were very popular among university age students, female students, was really interesting. And one of my friends, an interesting story, which actually isn't in the book, but they like to walk. So they like to go out hiking at the weekends and walk around the city. And they would go out often for 6-7 hours, go for a walk around the town. He was quite tall, quite thin, used to wear kind of short sleeve shirts, the sort of North Korean style shirts that men wear. And he bought a hat at one of the local department stores, and it was this straw hat. And you see North Korean people wearing these all the time. And he'd gone out for a walk, and he was stopped by some official police had pulled up in a car and had said they didn't see his face because he was walking, looking at his feet, walking around. And they said, "Where is your badge?" Because he wasn't wearing a Kim badge, his little red badge. And so they assumed that he was North Korean. And then when they saw his face, they went and saw he was a foreigner. They went, "Oh, we're so sorry. Oh my goodness, we're so sorry. Never mind." But that was an experience that a foreigner had, of state officials trying to control the way they were dressed, not wearing a badge. And I've seen women in conversations with soldiers, for example, pointing at skirts and skirt lengths and things. But as I say, that this is the thing that's interesting about the place is, even though there are all these restrictions, how creative people are within those, because you can't stop people from being people, and having a sense of self-expression. So that is fascinating. So I think, like most people, the only way I'd learned about the country was through books, through the news, particularly. I associated the country with the military, with missile launches, with images of Kim Jong-un. It was all in line with the propaganda, that Western propaganda as well, that I'd been fed. When I went there, as I mentioned earlier, at first I really noticed soldiers. I noticed the portraits of the Kims everywhere. I noticed the propaganda posters. But after time, that died away. It was still there, but I didn't acknowledge it in the same way. But then I had the freedom not to. North Korean people wouldn't have that choice. But it was interesting how it sort of sunk into the background and focus changed. Something that I found really quite interesting was in November 20, I think it was in 2017, or 2018, there was the nuclear tests, where North Korea tested their nuclear missile underground, and it was the first time that had happened in quite a while. When the announcement of that was made to North Korean people, I was standing at the big television screen that you would see on our news, with the news reporter, and she was speaking out into the city, telling everyone what had happened. And there was a large crowd of people, maybe 100, 150 North Koreans, gathered in formation with TV cameras and a director standing on a chair with a megaphone shouting things to them. And they were filming them clapping, dancing, all these things that we see on the news that we associate with North Korea. But I was standing in front of that crowd, and there are photos in the book of this moment. And the North Korean people around me, some of them were happy, some of them were clapping and thought this is great. Other people didn't really have any expression at all. They just were standing there watching, and then just left and went about their day, went to work. Children were still playing, didn't stop. There were such a range of reactions to that, and that's not what we see, especially when it comes to the North Korean state. We don't see those varieties of expressions, but they're there. And it's important to acknowledge them. So yeah, those would be the major things. Definitely in 2017, the tensions between North Korea and the US were probably at their lowest for a significant period of time. And I remember just before I arrived in North Korea, there'd been a missile test. And after I arrived, there was one. I heard and saw a missile from the garden of my apartment, as well, which I write about in the book. And it was tense. It was scary. It was undeniable that tension was also felt by North Koreans who I spoke to. Some of them would say to me, it's normal in the summer. Tensions are always at their worst. And this, it's just what happens. But that summer felt very different. And for the North Koreans I spoke to, I believed them when they said they were really worried about the situation. The best thing I could try and do was to explain to them that, at that time we were seeing Donald Trump saying we're going to unleash fire and fury on North Korea, and Kim Jong-un was calling him a dotard, and it was this back and forth. And we were all caught in the middle. And the best thing I could kind of do is to explain that it's not as simple for someone, for example, in the US, to just press a button and a war starts. There are rules and laws and ways to stop that from happening. And that seemed to reassure them a bit. But I think when you live in a country like North Korea, I would guess that if you're taught your whole life that you're on the brink of war, your country is behaving the way it is because it's been threatened, then that seems like a normal thing. But for me, certainly, it was tense. It was really tense, and I think it's very easy when you're far away in the world from that country to disassociate yourself from it and think, oh, it's just another missile. But actually, there are real people there living their lives who would be affected if there was a war, and it's important to try and connect with them and see it from their point of view. But again, with all of these missile launches, life went on. People still went to work, children went to school, people were still working, and that's not something you saw in the news. That people were. I think North Korean people are unbelievably resilient, and it's important to remember and acknowledge that. You start to second guess everything when you've been. I think anyone who's been there for a long amount of time would agree that you start to question what is real and what isn't. Is this person being honest with me, or are they just telling me what I want to hear? But there were a number of conversations I had with people and experiences where they instinctively felt sincere, and those are the ones I've written about in the book. Something that really stands out for me, which I've written about, is I was at a water park where there are lots of water slides and pools, and there were people enjoying cooling down on a hot summer's day. And I'd sat down and ordered a drink, and this older man walked over to me, and he had his grandchildren sort of holding onto his trousers, his legs, and he walked over and but I have very little Korean, but I was able to say a few things to him, and we spoke for a couple of moments. He asked me my name, and he introduced himself, and he handed me a sort of rubber ring that children would use to help them swim, and it was in the shape of a duck. It was a yellow ring, and he handed me this ring, and inside it was a baby, and there was a little baby girl all swaddled sleeping in the middle of this rubber duck. It had a sort of bottom on it, and he just put her in my lap, and I was just holding her, and she was so cute, so beautiful, and he just looked so proud, and he told me her name was Yue, I think he said her name was, and he just stood there for a moment, and I sort of rocked her and sort of played with her, and then handed her back, and then he sort of nodded his head, and he walked away. And it was those really special moments that you feel unbelievably privileged to just be there, and for someone to feel safe that they can share that with you. Because as I say, I think the thing I find still really difficult to remember about that experience is you just feel so scared of putting anyone at risk just by existing, and it's a feeling I've never felt before, and for people to be so kind and warm in that environment was just so moving. And as I've just continued to say, I just find North Korean people to be so kind, and I really hope that comes across in this book, that people who read it also get to experience that as well. I think one of the major things for me was it was such a lesson in myself of how much I did not appreciate or realize how many misconceptions I had about North Korean people. And I didn't realize how deeply they went. I always thought of myself as being a very open person, but actually, I had a lot of opinions about the place before I got there, and those were all challenged. I was very naive when I went there, thinking that I would really understand the place and I would really get to know it. And actually, when I left, I felt like I knew less when I left than when I arrived. I felt utterly clueless and thought, I have no idea about this country and what people really think. I can just speak from my own experience, and that's what this book represents. I think it's fundamentally changed me, and that I absolutely have taken my freedom for granted, and the freedoms I have of how I live my life and how I can think and travel and write. You know, I can write a book like this and I can express myself in the way I dress, and I just think it's something all of us can take for granted at some point every day, and I always make sure to remember that and appreciate it. For example, there was one earlier in the year that was launched from a train, and when I saw that on the TV, I wasn't looking at the missile, I was looking at the fields behind it and thinking, who planted that rice? Who is living in those houses that are somewhere over there? Who saw that? Who heard it? I'm just constantly thinking about my friends and their families and if they're safe, and that's what I really hope this book tries to do well, and I hope that readers connect with, is that they can also start to view the place a little differently and start to consider from the people's perspective rather than the political perspective, because people are not their politics all the time. You know, people are human beings, and we're wonderfully diverse and interesting. And yeah, I really hope readers can self-reflect by reading this book and also connect with the North Korean people. So it definitely, being able to take photos in the way I did was definitely only something you could do if you were there, in that capacity. So tourists, yeah, could not openly take those kinds of photographs. Um, the kinds of photographs that I took were mostly in public spaces. I never went into a North Korean person's house. If that was ever going to happen, it would have been very controlled, and I wouldn't want to put anyone in that situation. Um, but I think the key thing for me with taking photos was, again, just as anywhere in the world, was no, being able to feel when it was and wasn't appropriate. You know, if me taking a photo of something was going to make that person uncomfortable or put them at any kind of risk, then I didn't take the photo, because the person is more important than the photo. Um, but the photographs I have taken were in moments where it felt appropriate, and the moments I've written about were moments where it didn't feel, I was in the moment and I was living my life and encountering these people, and it felt more appropriate to write about it. Um, so I never encountered any difficulties. I never had anyone take my photos from me or my camera. But again, I think that was because I was just trying to be as respectful as possible. Um, but I do know that there have been tourists where that's happened. But again, it's different rules. But I think the most important thing out of everything is, even for tourists, is just to be respectful and just remember that there's a person. And like anywhere in the world, not everybody wants to have their photograph taken. But for me, I never encountered any difficulties with it. So I absolutely loved living in Taiwan. I was so lucky that I got to travel a bit while I was there. So I lived in Taipei, and I was able to go down to Kenting and Hualien and go to Taroko, which was just the most. I think the word awesome is reserved for places like that, of truly, I've never seen anything like that in my life. It was beautiful. And we've traveled around some other areas as well. I just found I found Taiwanese people to be so friendly and welcoming. And I brought my dog with me as well, so I got to meet lots of dog owners in Xiangshan Park and get to know them every day. Um, and in terms of food, oh, I think that is one of the most brilliant parts of Taiwan is its food. Um, I I could talk about it for hours. Places I like to go. I liked Rauha night market. I really enjoyed going there. Um, there were some really great places in Xinyi. I mean, I lived in Xinyi, but we would travel all over the city, and I really liked Gongguan. Um, and there's a lot of places there that I think I was there every week when they were saying, "Oh, it's you again," and having the the bao, the with the pork and
Yeah.
peanuts, and there was a soup with pork and sweet corn, which I really liked. I love hot pot. I love the braised pork with rice. Um, it's just all so good. It's just all really good, and I'm very jealous. And I can't find any good Taiwanese food since I've been back in the UK. I've been trying to find somewhere and I can't find any, and I'm going to have to come back. So as soon as I can get back to Taiwan, I will be there to share some food with friends because it's just the best thing. But yeah, I absolutely love Taiwan, and I really respect it and its people, and I have a lot of love for it, and I'm very grateful that I've been able to spend a good amount of time there. All right, here we go. 大家好，我想要谢谢我台湾的乐听人，谢谢你们支持这本书和它的意义。我希望你们都喜欢念它。我希望我有一天有在台湾机会来见你们。谢谢。